Vyacheslav Kharinov is getting his bikers ready for the journey ahead. First things first, he chooses a flag bearer. Meanwhile, I'm busy setting up my camera. I'm turning biker for a week for a fascinating trip from Russia to Germany and a journey into the history of both countries. The tour starts here in St Petersburg, in the Mother of God Cathedral downtown. I catch up with Vyacheslav Kharinov and members of his congregation. The Russian Orthodox priest has a mission to visit the resting places of Russian soldiers missing or killed in action during World War II. This woman wants to find out what happened to her great-uncle. He was last heard of in Germany. Vyacheslav Kharinov tells me that he's frequently confronted with tales of suffering, drama and ill fortune. People tell me the most incredible war stories. They hope that I will find their relatives. When I look in their faces, I feel the great burden of responsibility that I carry, he says. For now, the priest is responsible for the 20 people who are going to accompany him to Germany. Half of them are bikers, just like himself, the other half members of his congregation, men and women. The luggage is so tightly packed, Ludmila wonders whether they'll be able to find anything. Vyacheslav expects to reach the Finnish border on time if they set off at 10 a.m. But it's a long trip, you never know. I hope the weather's great. I've never been to Europe, it's exciting. It'll be fine. The priest is surprised by his mother's maudlin goodbye. We'll see each other again, he reassures her. The bikers set off punctually. The sound of their departure is hard to ignore. Do svidaniya, St Petersburg. 300 kilometers to go before we reach the Finnish border. Let the road movie roll. Vyacheslav rides at the head of the convoy. 5 hours later, we reach Helsinki. Everything is going to plan. The weather is great. The group is having great fun. We're all enjoying the Baltic Sea air. On the ferry to Germany, we have more than 24 hours to get to know each other better. Vladimir says they might be bikers, but that they wanted to do something meaningful, not just drive around. Our grandfathers drove tanks to Germany, we're riding motorbikes, says Vadim. But Vladimir says his grandfather spent his childhood in a German concentration camp. I'm dedicating this trip to him, he says. Vyacheslav and his Russian travel companions are very hospitable. They invite me to join them for supper and a glass of the hard stuff in their cabin. Every ship has an official dining room and an informal one. It seems this is where the party's at. Many of the bikers are traveling to Germany for very personal reasons. Memories of World War II are still very much alive in most Russian families. I was an only child, Vyacheslav tells us. My father was a young man when he fought in the war. His worst experience was after a German tank attack. My father was badly wounded, but he survived, unlike his comrades. My father had to crawl over their dead bodies, which had been squashed by German panzers. Germany was the last resting place for his comrades. My father's story is my legacy, the driving force to commemorate his fellow soldiers, them and millions of others who fell in the war. I want to say, we haven't forgotten you. Arrival on German soil. 68 years after the end of World War II, in a vastly changed country. Our tour will take us ultimately to southern Germany. On the itinerary, memorial sites, mass graves, military cemeteries, meetings with people who lived through those times. Our first stop is Hamburg, in Ohlsdorf, the large cemetery with mass war graves. Got the wreath? Let's go. I'm amazed. The Russians visit a German memorial site first. It's a burial site for air raid victims killed in the Allied firebombings of Hamburg in 1943. Well over 30,000 Germans are buried here. These Germans weren't waging war, says Vyacheslav. The Germans in this grave were victims themselves. They weren't responsible for the war crimes of the German Air Force and Hitler's army. They were simply people who were barbarously butchered. As a Christian, you shouldn't repay evil with evil. I'm touched by the Russian gesture and by the memorial, a sculpture with figures from Greek mythology. Their nakedness symbolizes the helplessness of the civilian victims. I find the Russian Orthodox prayer for the dead deeply moving. I feel the sincerity of the Russian Christians in their mourning for German war victims. After the group photo, we move on to Russian war graves. Here, Vyacheslav the biker is once more transformed into Father Vyacheslav. In the Russian part of the cemetery, he's going to pray for former prisoners of war, for forced laborers.
Благословен Бог наш всегда, ныне и присно и во веки веков. Аминь. За духи праведных скончавшихся, души рабы спаси упокой.
Almost 400 Soviet citizens are buried here. Under the Stalin regime, they were decried as traitors.
Помилуй нас, Боже, по велицей милости Твоей, молим Тебя, услыши, помилуй. Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй.
The prayer is for those who had to suffer twice over, victims of the Nazis and of Soviet propaganda. We should not forget that it was Germans who brought the remains of Soviet soldiers here and buried them, says Father Vyacheslav, and it's Germans who still look after these graves today. It is good that we are doing what our fellow Russians have neglected to do, our diplomats, our government. We are fulfilling an honorable mission by remembering the dead and the fallen who have unfortunately been forgotten by our Russian homeland.
Забыв, увы, очень многих из своих погребенных и ушедших.
Over the next few days, we travel down country roads and highways, spending the night in camping sites or setting up our own camps. We travel through towns and villages that the Red Army once marched through. We arrive in Flossenburg in Bavaria, a place associated with one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. The former site of a Nazi concentration camp. We visit what's left of the machinery of mass murder, the death row with barracks that were dubbed the laundry. Here inmates were forced to undress before being sent to their deaths in the crematorium next door. 85,000 innocent people were detained here. Most were Poles or Russians. I feel a personal obligation to commemorate the victims at sites like these. My companions who have accompanied me on this remembrance tour will take their impressions with them. Father Vyacheslav says we should never let the memory of the war fade. And that's why it's important for my generation who didn't experience the war, for me and the Russian bikers to come here, to a place which pains us. I'm very sad, says Vladimir. I'm thinking about my grandfather, who was taken to a concentration camp as a child. I don't even know which one. Maybe it was here. How could they do that to him? The Russians joined together in song before starting back on their long journey home.